Hey therapists, I think we all know that work doesn't end when the session does. There's the notes, the scheduling, the billing, the insurance follow-ups. All of the admin work can quietly take over your nights and weekends, and I know this to be true because I have done it myself for many years. But recently, Psychologist Off the Clock co-hosts Debbie, Emily, and Jill convinced me to try out Simple Practice, and I'm so glad I did. Simple Practice is an all-in-one EHR that is HIPAA compliant, high-trust certified, and built specifically for therapists. The beautiful thing is that it brings all the things together that you would otherwise have to do in piecemeal fashion. That's scheduling, billing, insurance, client communication. It's all in one place so you're not juggling multiple systems just to run your practice. I love that the forms are customizable and make documentation much faster and less draining, and I really appreciate that I don't have to spend hours each month generating invoices for clients. What's more, if you're just starting out or growing your practice, they also have a credentialing service that helps you to get paneled independently. It takes the total headache out of the insurance enrollment, giving you full autonomy over your own contracts without any middleman platforms taking a cut. If you are ready to simplify the business side of your practice, now is a great time to try Simple Practice. Start with a 7-day free trial, then get 50% off your first 3 months. Just go to simplepractice.com to claim the offer. Again, that's simplepractice.com.
It really helps to just remember that there might be an agenda behind that, because everyone knows that fear sells, and it also just doesn't necessarily reflect the research at all and what we can interpret from the research accurately.
The problem with inaccurate science, with fear-based approaches, is that we know in public health that absolutist stances don't work and cause us to miss real solutions as well as more long-term sustainable solutions.
True scientists and researchers know that we almost never prove anything because science does change. What resources we have changes, our mechanisms change.
Kids who are vulnerable in some way in their offline lives, those kids are the most likely to turn to AI, too much for their schoolwork, using AI more for companionship and more for emotional support and that kind of thing.
That was our roundtable of parenting science experts on Psychologists Off the Clock.
We are 5 experts in psychology here to bring you cutting-edge and science-based ideas to help you flourish in your relationships, work, and health.
I'm Dr. Debbie Sorensen, a clinical psychologist practicing in Mile High, Denver, Colorado, author of Act for Burnout and Act Daily Journal.
From America's Heartland, I'm Dr. Emily Edlin, a clinical psychologist based in Chicago, Illinois, and author of Autonomy Supportive Parenting.
Calling in from Vienna, Austria, I'm Michael Herold, ACT coach, confidence trainer, and the author of an upcoming book on developing your confidence and social skills.
From Boston, I'm Dr. Yael Schoenbrunn, faculty at Brown University and author of Work, Parent, Thrive, and Why Don't You Understand Me?
And from coastal New England, I'm Dr. Jill Stoddard, author of Be Mighty, The Big Book of ACT Metaphors, and Imposter No More.
We hope you take what you learn here to build a rich and meaningful life.
Thank you for listening to Psychologists Off the Clock.
Hey listeners, just a super quick reminder that you can listen to the podcast ad-free by supporting us on Patreon for just $5 a month. Or you can support the podcast with a one-time donation on Buy Me a Coffee. Thank you to everyone who's already supporting us.
Hi, everyone. I am so excited today that we are departing from our usual format to bring together a group of esteemed experts to take on the timely topic of navigating the science of parenting in today's age of information overload, misinformation, clickbait headlines, sound bites, and unqualified but highly popular influencers. I hope listeners leave this discussion feeling more confident to discern when to pay attention, when to bring skepticism, and when to straight out ignore what you hear or read. Some listeners may have heard me talk about how I started writing about parenting 10 years ago because I was so disappointed in how I saw science being misused to make parenting harder, not better. That's why today it's like a dream come true to bring together this panel of incredibly smart, passionate, and wise experts who write about parenting science professionally. First, we have Melinda Winter Moyer, an award-winning science journalist and author. She's a contributing editor at Scientific American magazine and a regular contributor at the New York Times. She's the author of How to Raise Kids Who Aren't Assholes and Hello, Cruel World. She also writes the very popular parenting Substack, Now What? And you can hear more from Melinda on our past episodes about her books in episodes 409 and 214. We also have Tracy Dennis Tawari, a clinical psychologist, professor, researcher, mental health tech entrepreneur, and AI safety advisor. Her research focuses on the intersection between digital technology and mental health. She writes about growing up and growing old in the digital age in news outlets like the New York Times, Wall Street Journal, and Washington Post, as well as on her Substack, The Future of Sanity. She is author of the book, Future Tense, Why Anxiety is Good for You, Even Though It Feels Bad. And you can hear Tracy on our past episodes 266 and 382. And then finally, we have a first timer on the podcast, Jacqueline Nisi, a clinical psychologist, associate professor at Brown University, and author of the popular weekly newsletter, Technosapiens. Her research focuses on the role of technology in kids' mental health, especially teens, and on how parents can help. Welcome to Psychologists Off the Clock.
Thank you.
Great to be here.
Thanks for having us.
So let's start at the beginning of time. Not really. But psychology as a field has a pretty sordid history with how research has been conducted. And the same holds true for parenting science as part of psychological study. So I wanted to start with what you all see as historically problematic about parenting science and what we have learned to make today's research better.
The big question that has driven a lot of parenting research is, what is good parenting? And I think a lot of these earliest theories, like Diana Baumrein's theory, which really set the stage for so much of what came after, this notion of, along the dimensions of warmth and control, how can we describe parenting as either good or bad or helpful or unhelpful? And I was going back to some of that earliest research, and her very first studies concluded, this is the 70s, 80s, 90s, that actually parenting can only be interpreted in context. And she, of course, is the one who developed this taxonomy of authoritative, authoritarian, and permissive parenting. And then you have Maccabee and Martin, who talked about warmth and control and how all of us parents kind of fall along those dimensions. But what really was one of the first points made about these parenting styles is that you can only interpret it in context. So if you really go back and read the parenting research, it talks about things like no-nonsense parenting, which is a type of parenting that feels a little bit more authoritarian to us, a little bit more control, a little bit more rules and, hierarchy and just do what I say. But when that's combined with warmth, what a lot of these early researchers and sociologists found is that that is a very adaptive, responsive type of parenting if you're in an environment with fewer resources, where there's more danger. So there were a lot of studies of communities of color and communities that were lower SES, where these very first researchers, Baumrein, Maccabee, and Martin, and a lot of the cross-cultural researchers that were coming out, Harkness and Super, we were all saying, it depends. Good parenting depends. So I do want to kind of make a bid.
Give some credit.
Yeah. Give credit where credit's due. And I actually think if you do parenting research, that has not changed. If anything, we've become more sensitive. I think about some of my doctoral students interested in parenting, and they're really thinking about the meaning of parenting, what parents are trying to do to prepare their kids for the world that they're in, the community they're in, the peer and school environment they're in. So I think, actually, before we talk about what's wrong, if I may just say, there's so much that's foundational that's right, and I think we can continue to build on that.
Well, I think that's an excellent starting point, and I like how it's framed as the foundation, because we're going to get into the misuse of parenting science. And I think what's happened is the translation of this parenting science as nuanced and contextual, and it depends, has been completely lost in translation in the media, right? And so that's where we're getting stuck as parents and feeling like we're not doing it right and we're not good parents. So I'm so glad you framed this, Tracy, in this way, because I think that is why I'm motivated to do this episode specifically. Melinda and Jackie, do you have more to add?
This is actually making me think about, like, when you're translating science into advice, which is something I try to do, but be very careful about, because I'm always saying it really depends on your family, it depends on your kids. Like, some things might work for you and not work for somebody else. This is making me think of Elizabeth Weingarten's recent book that I just read and wrote about in my newsletter, which is How to Fall in Love with Questions.
She was also on our podcast.
Amazing. She talked about how advice, there's open and closed systems of advice that people can give. And a closed system is basically saying you have to do it this way. If it doesn't work for you, that means you're doing it wrong. And open systems basically acknowledge that this might work for you, it might not. It really depends on the context. It really depends on, for parenting research, the family. And if it's not working for you, that is not a reflection on, how well, quote unquote, you're doing it, or a sign that you're doing it wrong. And I really appreciated that framework. So when we're thinking about translating science to advice, or, trying to spread the knowledge or insights from the research, to keep in mind that, like, if you're being told that it has to be one way, or if you're not getting the results you want, that you're doing it wrong, like, that's a sign that it's a closed system, which is really not helpful and not constructive.
Okay, I'm just going to pause on that is like one red flag, right, to watch out for if we're reading this quote unquote advice or parenting guidance. If there is this messaging that this is the one right way, that in itself is a red flag.
I want to actually dig in really directly to what some of these earlier parenting researchers said about the importance of context. And it wasn't just that everyone parents different. It was really trying to analyze what works for different people in different contexts at different times. And so the no-nonsense parenting style you see in a lot of immigrant communities. I was talking with my husband about this morning. He's the son of immigrants. And he talked about this sort of this no nonsense, like, you do what you have to do. You work harder than, twice as hard as everyone else. And there was warmth and there was structure. And sometimes it's you just do what I say. But if you're in an environment that you're navigating it, you're building a life, that sort of, what people might say is authoritarian, which is low warmth but high control, I think is missing the mark of what some of this kind of more directive or a little tough lovey kind of parenting, how that can function in different communities at different times. And so I think for parenting researchers to do a better job of translating that into the information that gets out to people so they can start to think about their own lives and what kinds of, what am I doing that prepares my child for the world we live in? And just kind of, and thinking about this more expansive set of values, not just the weird values, the Western, educated, industrialized. And I think a lot of the advice skews to weird cultures as well, and this one perspective. So I think this contextual thinking, the more that we see those red flags that you just mentioned of, like, this is, this it has to be this way, the more that is not science, because of this deeply contextual perspective that the research has really supported. And a lot of folks like Jean Brody and other folks who coined the term, Jean Brody coined the term no-nonsense parenting. If you are fear-inducing, that is never a culture, and
Right.
we know this instinctively. We also know this from the research that, yes, sometimes you have a more no-nonsense parenting style, but if it bleeds over into coerciveness, control, kind of a scary control,
Yep.
that is not ever predictive of positive child developmental outcomes.
Right. Yeah, I can't not plug autonomy supportive parenting that I've immersed myself in. And really, that I love the science of that, because there is so much flexibility within that framework. And it's really how I present it is it's finding the blend of freedom and structure that fits each kid and the environment, right? And so that's going to vary, but within that combination of freedom and structure, there's supporting agency and autonomy, even with maybe very firm, clear structure. But it's because it fits the kids' needs or the environment that we're raising the kids in.
That's right. And developmental niche, we know from cross-cultural research, like, you look at countries that are quite different than some of Western countries or the United States. And what it means to be autonomy supportive can also change.
Yes.
We, especially in weird countries, we talk a lot at our kids. We're always asking them questions, we're interrogating them, and we're trying to support their identity, their individual identity. But in more interdependent cultures,
Yep.
say, people often turn to Japan when they try to understand interdependence. India, Tibet, you see very different styles, and you see less talky, more physicality of being with, rather than emphasizing the individuation
Yes.
between you and your child by asking all those questions. So there's also that spectrum of autonomy that's very interesting and important to consider.
Yep. Thank you for that, Tracy. Well, one thing, I love how we're complementing parenting science, but I do think we need to bring a critical eye as well. And I remember going through graduate school, and one of the biggest caveats in all the parenting research I was studying is how it was all mother report or focusing on mother-child relationships, and dads and men were pretty much left out of the research. Now, the reality of this is very complicated. So what are your all thoughts on that?
Well, it's certainly a problem that we don't have more dads doing research. A couple of years ago, talked to somebody who was actively trying to conduct research of dads related to parenting. And she said it was so hard to recruit them. Like, even when she would say specifically, like, we want dads and only dads, they just didn't get the volunteers they needed. And so that, that's really interesting and raises, a lot of interesting questions about sort of how fathers feel what fathers feel their role is in raising kids and parenting. But I think when we think about the fact that moms are so overrepresented as caregivers in this research, it really means there's a lot of limitations to what we can conclude about parenting in general. Like, a lot of what we can infer is really about mothering, right? And we don't know whether the findings relating to mothers also apply to fathers. We don't know how much the identity of the parent matters, whether it's the behavior or, the behavior in the context of the person providing it. Like, there's just so much that we don't know. And also, when we think about just different kinds of families, if so much of the research is looking at families with a mother and a father, like, how much, what can we say about families with two mothers or two fathers? And so it just really highlights that although we have so much great research and we've learned so much, there's also just so much that we don't know because of the limitations of the samples that we've been using.
Another big downside of that lopsidedness in terms of representation of mothers is there's also the very dark history of blaming mothers for everything, and the whole refrigerator mother, before understanding better autism and schizophrenia, it was the coldness of the mother that was the reason for the behaviors associated with autism and schizophrenia. And so I think that it's double-edged, where we may understand and have more data on mothers and mothering, but it's also placed a huge burden on us, which results in more self-blame that is like part of mothering culture at this point, in my opinion.
I blame Freud.
Yeah, okay. You can blame Freud for everything.
For everything. I mean, it's a cliche. It's a cliche for a reason. Tell me about your mother when and that wasn't a German accent, but whatever else. But I think you're so right about that double-edged sword. I think it's also an artifact of, or a consequence of the fact that, mothers have been the primary caregiver traditionally. And I think we just haven't contended with we certainly don't get credit for the things that go right.
Yeah, right.
Maybe that's just a negativity bias. But I think like delving into, I think you're so right to call it a dark history. To imagine being blamed. I have two teenagers, and I'm imagining and being blamed, as still happens today, for your child's autism or your child's, schizophrenia or any child mental health problems in a way that's a one-to-one correspondence. And it leaves less room for parents, I think, to think about, okay, it's not all my fault. And instead of but thinking, and what can I do differently to support this human being in front of me who has their own strengths and vulnerabilities and temperament. So I think this, as you say too, this dark history prevents us from getting to the kind of parenting that we know is the most effective, which is a goodness of fit, the flexibility each of us has to not just say the parenting advice industrial complex is telling us to do these 10 things, but to follow our instinct and understand how we can complement our children and scaffold and support them.
Yes, very true.
The best summer pieces are the ones you end up wearing on repeat. Comfortable, versatile, and somehow right for almost every occasion. That's why I love Quince. They make elevated essentials using premium materials like European linen, organic cotton, and washable silk without the traditional retail markup. Everything at Quince is priced 50 to 80% less than similar brands. They work directly with ethical factories and cut out the middleman, so you're paying for exceptional quality rather than brand markup. On a more personal note, for about a decade, my bags have said, "Functional Mom." The Sloan hand-woven mini shoulder bag just arrived at my house, and the gorgeous weave detail says, "Stylish woman who has places to be." Both are true. One of them just hasn't had a good bag in a while. But it's not just apparel. Quince also has elevated essentials for your home, from bedding and bath to kitchen essentials and furniture. Make your summer wardrobe feel easier. Go to quince.com/POTC for free shipping on your order and 365-day returns. Now available in Canada too. That's QUINCE.com/POTC for free shipping and 365-day returns. Quince.com/POTC.
I want to move a little bit towards methodology because I think that's just an important piece to always discuss when we're talking about science. And I think, Jackie, you brought up in our prep for this episode that there is a better mix of methods. Do you want to talk a little bit about that?
Yeah. So I do think that over time, the research it's gotten a bit more inclusive, although I think we still have a long way to go. And I think coming back to what we were just saying, I do think as well that even though we're not in the research, maybe blaming mothers as much, I do think in the communication of the research, that still often comes across. Like we're using different words to describe the findings. But I think that there's many cases where mothers in particular do feel blamed or it's all on them to make changes in their parenting. But in terms of the research itself, yeah, I do think that over time we've seen, just as I think we've started to realize that there are so many individual and cultural differences in terms of how parenting works and what works for one person does not work for another. I think that's true in the research too, and that we've started to see that we need to be using a variety of methods in order to really get at what's happening in different families and what's working for different families. So that can include a lot of different things. I'll just share an example of a study that I did recently. So looking at the strategies that parents were using around managing their kids' digital technology use. And for that, we used surveys, which are, traditionally used, as we know, in psychology research, probably too much, parents were reporting on their behaviors. Their teens were also reporting on the parents' behaviors. But then we also used an observational task. So basically meaning that we prompted the teen and the parent to talk about how, in like a structured way, to talk about how they were using technology and how the parents were managing it. And we were able to then look at that later and code it. We did ecological momentary assessment, or EMA, basically meaning we kind of pinged the teen and the parent a couple times a day to learn about how they were approaching these things. So we use this kind of range of methods. And outside of that study, we're seeing a lot more things like passive sensing. So that would be like using people's phones or maybe a wearable. We're looking at people's movement patterns, their heart rate, even in some cases like snippets of audio throughout the day, like to learn about the kinds of conversations that parents are having with their kids. And then getting even more complex, of course, there's a range of studies out there that look at the brain or try to look at the brain with things like fMRI to learn more about what's happening in parents' brains while they're engaging in different parenting behaviors.
I wanted to talk about the brain research because I do see that as another area of potential danger where if we hear a result about the brain, it must be true. And I have seen a lot of misuse, and there's just, I think, not enough lay understanding of the brain to realize like this actually doesn't mean anything, or we don't know what it means. I'd love your thoughts on that.
That happens all the time. And I'm a person who got a degree in clinical psychology and then retrained in cognitive neuroscience. So I sort of retrained to study emotion and emotion regulation because I thought, if we could just look under the hood, we'd know exactly what was going on. And it turns out that the methodological noise, the messiness of collecting neural data is as great, if not greater, than observational data. So that's the first thing. It's very messy. It's also when you measure something like MRI, right? You're looking at blood oxygenation level, for example, in the brain, which means this part of the brain, is more active. You are often, this idea that there's this one area of the brain that's doing this one thing, right? You're like, oh, the prefrontal cortex is lighting up because the pictures show color differences. It's just has nothing to do with a dynamic brain that's doing many, many things at once. I do EEG research, which is even more difficult to interpret because you're putting electrodes on the scalp and you're sort of reading these fluctuations in brain activity and even presynaptic activity, even activity that happens before the brain, before neurons fire, for example. And we've learned over 100 years of experimentation, not me personally, but the field, that certain signals indicate certain things. But we don't even know if more means better or less means better. I mean, it's a lot of inference. It's a lot of smoke signals. So as you say, we have to start bashing this scientific interpretation bias in the media to say, if the brain says it, then it's true. And it must be true, which is, of course, as much shaped by experience as it shapes what we do. So that bidirectionality, it's hard to get across in a clickbaity headline.
Yeah, I think the other challenge is not only do we think that it's true if it's related to the brain, but we also think that it can't be changed. Like, I think there's this sense that if it's happening in the brain, that's just the way it is and it's set and there's nothing we can do about it. It's sort of deterministic. And of course, we know that that's not how the brain works, not how humans work. And so I think that's another challenge in communicating that type of research.
Well, and how much does this influence parental anxiety? I mean, it feels like, oh my gosh, this is damaging my child's brain, right? That is probably one of the scariest prospects. And so then we act like it really influences parenting behavior to have these sort of semi-findings, right? They're not solid findings. They're not proven knowledge, but the prospect is so scary that it can affect parent behavior.
It just really speaks to the power of fear in selling things to parents, in moving parents in certain social and policy directions, which I think we might get to in our conversation a little later. So fear, and for a parent, like I don't know, we're all, in our experiences of parenting, it's like what you realize is that the times that you're actually at your best as a parent is when you sort of surrender to your imperfection. Yep. And so meanwhile, we have this whole parenting culture and the self-help culture that's telling us to not embrace that. Really, we're looking for certainty. We want the brain to tell us how to raise our kids. And really I think this key skill of parenting is distress tolerance, is being able to be comfortable with the distress of knowing that you don't know and you're just doing your best with this spectacular human in front of you.
Yeah.
Yeah. And even if you think you know something, actually putting that into practice as a parent, it's like also next to impossible sometimes. We're all human. What you're saying about, fear selling, I just want to highlight a study that has stuck with me that came out, I think, last year, maybe. And I talked about it in my newsletter, where researchers analyzed online articles about children and screen time that were published, I think, from 2016 to 2021. And they tracked how much attention these articles received on social media. And they found that the studies that really portrayed screen use negatively were much more likely to be shared and go viral. And especially those that use really alarming language, like irreversible damage and risks that are skyrocketing, urgent steps parents need to take, like the ones that really push hard on the fear button, are the ones that got shared. So, I mean, fear really does sell. And I think also influencers really know that. They're trying to sell solutions in the form of classes or books or whatever it is. And so, anytime we're encountering, I think, that kind of fear-based alarmist language, I think it really helps to just remember that there might be an agenda behind that because everyone knows that fear sells, and it also just doesn't necessarily reflect the research at all and what we can interpret from the research accurately.
Well, and the paradox of that frustrates me so much is that when we are parenting from fear, it's worse, as we're talking about. We know that's worse for our kids and for us. yet that's what gets all the oxygen. And it's just this terrible spiral that we see out there, which is why it's so important to get good science into the mainstream, right? That's, I think, what all of us are out here trying
I
to
want
do.
to question that for a second, if I could play devil's advocate, because I don't think we need more good science. I think we have enough science to know some
Yeah.
good. Now we need to do much more, and blah, blah, blah. I mean, that's every scientist's, like, you wake up every morning thinking that. And I don't think it's a problem of information anymore. It's the system in which we're trying to communicate.
Yeah.
And I think it's rigged against anything that's
Yeah.
nuanced or true.
Yeah.
And I think that's reality. I think we have to really think outside the box with this. And I think we have to come together as people to say the way that our communication media are structured, nuance will never win. The algorithm is winning right now, and it's going to continue to win for the foreseeable future. So I guess the question I ask you all is, listen, we're communicating via the algorithm. This is a great podcast. We're going to come through the algorithm to you. And what do we also do to put our humanity at the center? What do we do to actually communicate? And maybe it won't go viral or spread as quickly, but I think we have to be messaging, rather than always fighting the algorithm, we have to do and also do something else. I don't know if you have thoughts about that or if you just disagree, but I feel that way these days, that we have to do something outside the box.
Well, and I do think there's a desire out there for more nuanced communication, right? Like, I think that, although we tend to be drawn to these things that the algorithm, puts in our faces and that are more extreme and that gets our attention, I do think at the end of the day, there are a lot of parents out there who really just want to know the truth and they want to know what's going to work. And they're open to hearing, the messiness of the research and the complexities and the things that are not, summarized in a quick headline. And so I think it's about figuring out how to reach those people and how to share with them in ways that are effective.
Yeah, I feel like we all have newsletter subscribers and we are writing about the nuance. And so there is an audience for it. But yeah, I agree. Like, how do we reach the other ones who want this or who appreciate this or who we can educate about the value of this? That's really hard.
It's interesting, Tracy, how you're framing this, because I've realized in my writing and communication, I have been not using the science as much as I used to. And I think it has been, now that you're saying it like this, I think it has been a response to that's not really what's needed. I have found myself really trying to write for the emotional experience of being a parent and to connect with that first, and then information comes, if that makes sense.
We have to be storytellers, I think.
Yeah.
And I'm not imagining a world, and this is my approach to like digital, hygiene as well. I don't think we're going to live in this absolutist world of like no screens or no algorithm in the foreseeable future. But I think that's really interesting, because if we can tell a story and keep doubling down on, okay, there's a story that's not just black and white.
Yeah.
And then, use the science because we're scientists and actually value implicitly and explicitly expertise and science.
Yeah. And I find that when I write a newsletter that really comes from the heart or where I'm sharing my own experiences and being vulnerable, those are shared and liked and commented on so much more than like, here's a study I just read that I'm going to describe. And, it really does resonate a lot more. And so I completely agree that I think that is the way forward.
So I want to talk about the movement to ban phones and screens and where we fall on that. And one thing about, I think of them as the digital absolutists. It's like all or none. It's like, and actually, if you read John Haidt's book, which I read every word of, I wrote a book review for it, actually. So I read every word. And here's what he said in the very final paragraphs. He said, I've been struggling to figure out what is happening to us. How is this technology changing us? And this was his answer. The phone-based life produces spiritual degradation, not just in adolescence, but in all of us. So this is the absolutism I'm talking about. This is the spirit of this movement. It's also very good spirit to also help, all of us wake up to some of the real dangers and harms of the digital world, right? But this is this absolutism. And I look at it and I think, wow, they built a movement.
Yeah.
Because as I think about the other question of like, how do we go outside the algorithm? They built a movement. It's demagogic. It's based on fear, but it's a movement and it gives parents an answer. So can we do something similar without being demagogues is my question to you.
Well, and I think what's successful about that book and that message is the certainty. And you touched on this a little bit earlier, Tracy, like how much parents are craving certainty. And that's why these very black and white messages are more popular, I think, without the nuance. Because the truth is, we don't have certainty. We don't know how our kids are going to turn out. There's no way, right? And so I think that's where that book touched the emotional part of parenting is I want to know what to do and why. And John Haidt gave the reasoning. However, as Tracy and I were part of a panel on the podcast, it's episode 382, where we did a whole roundtable really dissecting the problems with how the science was used in that book. So I really encourage listeners to go back to that. We're not absolutely against the message, but we take issue with the integrity of how the science was used to inform the message. I think that book, which has been a huge kind of generational shifter, I mean, this is maybe the most influential parenting book of the last 10 years. And maybe I'm being hyperbolic, but that's how it feels to me as someone who's been in the space for the last 10 years. But I think it's also a bit of a cautionary tale. It touches on what we've been discussing, which is using fear, using science partially. So there's a lot of what we call cherry picking, where it's using the data and results that support your thesis while not acknowledging data and results that do not support the thesis.
I feel moral disgust at misusing science. Like I really believe in science and rigor and academic honesty. And I think when we make that argument to folks, a lot of folks are like, well, who cares? Right.
Yeah.
So I think the problem with not following the science is that we get worse solutions. The problem with inaccurate science, with fear-based approaches, with this sort of digital absolutism, is that we know in public health that absolutist stances don't work. Yeah. We know that just say no to drugs failed miserably. We know that the abstinence pledges in the AIDS crisis actually made things worse, right? And it distracts us and causes us to miss real solutions as well as more long-term sustainable solutions.
Yeah, I think it undermines the public's trust in science and other institutions in a way that is so broadly damaging. I mean, if you think about the COVID pandemic and the fear of the vaccines, like that was such a reflection of a distrust in science. And I think the way that science was communicated sometimes really didn't help that. I remember that there was a lot of discussion about how when the science changed with COVID, as we learned more, that was a reflection of science being bad and wrong instead of a process, right? Science is a process. And the fact that the public could not understand that and thought, oh, this has changed, therefore we can't trust any of science, was just like, it blew my mind. Like, wow, we have so much education to do about what is science even. And again, and being honest about the limitations of science and about the process and what it entails is just so important. And when we have books that are like John Haidt's book that are just so like, this is the way it is, the science is, this is the proof, it's deterministic, right. There's no room for questioning it, like that just does so much damage for public health and for just the public's understanding of science and respect for science.
Yeah, I just want to pause on that as another red flag, because what I want to do is kind of like pull out these red flags for listeners. Another red flag is true scientists and researchers know that we almost never prove anything because of what you're talking about, Melinda, that the science does change. What we know changes. What resources we have changes. Our mechanisms change. And so it's if you see the word "this proves," that is time to be skeptical.
I think one of the other challenges that comes up with with this kind of thing when you're trying to make kind of sweeping statements about the research that, one thing, say social media causes mental health problems on a large scale, which is one of the arguments that's made in the book. Like, I think that it also sort of distracts us from what we can actually see on the ground. And like when it comes to technology, I think most of the people in this debate and most of us would say that like a lot of these platforms we're talking about have real problems. And like we can see the problems, we can
Feel
see the
them.
ways that they're not. Yes, we can feel them. We can see the ways that they're not serving our kids well, and they're right in front of our eyes. And I think the challenge is when we try to then say, we try to take that leap to this is causing mental health problems, science proves it, here are the graphs, then we get stuck because we're trying to like make this larger case. And of course there's going to be debate about that, of debate about the science. And then we don't end up making, I think, sort of taking very common sense steps to address the very real problems that we can see right in front of us. It sort of gets us locked into these debates and these conversations about the science that we maybe don't actually need in order to make real changes.
Yeah, it's like a deflection of
Yeah.
where attention should go.
I think part of John Haidt's motivation was at the policy level. I mean, he's not, by the way, a clinical psychologist or a developmental psychologist. He's a social psychologist. And what he did when he used that knowledge about morality and it's like he gave his code book in his earlier research on like, how the elephant and the rider. The elephant are our emotions, and the rider is our decisions, and the moral feelings and emotions we have drive. He literally created a huge elephant, which is the phone-free childhood movement.
Yeah.
And so it's a manipulation, and so that's known. And at the same time, I feel like he wanted to help kids.
Yeah.
So I see that mix of motivations, and maybe there were other motivations too. And what I'm always puzzled by is that he doesn't do what Jackie just mentioned, which is just to say, okay, we've gotten the alarm bell is rung. Now let's step back and look at a kid's full life. So we know, for example, that if we're trying to predict mental health struggles, what accounts for the greatest variance? Parenting mental health issues. Yes. Child abuse.
Trauma.
I got my start actually in studying child maltreatment, and I can tell you these environments, like parent suicide, parent drug addiction, and the recent CDC, the huge CDC data set that came out, when it looked at, if you actually look at the associations between parents and a kid's lived experience and mental health outcomes, technology use accounts for a really relatively very tiny bit. So why doesn't this movement say, okay, listen, now let's turn to these kids' lives and know that for among our most vulnerable, these platforms can be particularly problematic in all these ways that we should that we should change X, Y, Z. Like, why don't they do that at this stage now that they've won? In some sense, there's some sense in which they've won. They haven't won all over the place, but they've won. Why do you think they don't do that? It'll be the right thing to do so we could help create digital citizenship.
It's kind of like the moral thing to do, right? Yeah.
It would be the moral thing to do. So
Yeah.
I don't understand why they're not.
Yeah.
Well, I think the movement has sort of gone beyond, the movement has sort of run away, right? Where it's like, and I think, everyone is always looking for the simplest possible explanation for challenges. And we see there are kids who are struggling with their mental health. And this feels like the easiest thing to pin it on. It feels like the easiest thing to regulate, although that hasn't maybe proven out. Yeah. But it feels like a sort of simple thing we can latch onto without having to address these much larger systemic issues.
These bans do nothing. These bans do zero. It just makes kids get around them. Maybe it's helping them be a little more rebellious teenagers because everyone says that kids today don't have enough sex, drugs, and rock and roll, which I disagree with. But anyway, I don't know. It makes no sense. If you actually care about kids and their long-term development, and knowing that we can't make them take chastity pledges in any real way that helps them be, the metaphor here being sex, like sexually healthy adult people, the same goes for. So it just makes no sense to me anymore. This movement has ceased to make sense. Maybe you're right, Jackie. Maybe it's just run away.
But I think it's a good illustration of how science really can meaningfully intersect with policy and real life and has power, and that we need to be moral about how we use that power. And that's a larger issue to take on.
I'm trying to find solutions. I want you brains on this. I keep on asking you questions. Is there one nuanced finding that you think these regulators or these government, these folks who make policy could wrap their head around, that's not just ban the phones, that we could actually fight for? Like, what is that? What is that science-informed practice? Maybe that's what we have to articulate.
Well, Jackie, you do a lot of work in this space. Like, I bet you have some ideas.
Well, I think in terms of like policy, I think I am still thinking through what, what makes sense. Like, I often feel like a lot of cases with policy, I think we don't necessarily know what's going to work and what the unintended consequences are going to be. And, of course, we're just trying to figure out, what's best. And it's funny with the social media bans in particular, not the phone bans, but social media bans and the conversations about that. I think that most of my academic colleagues are very against the bans. I think I'm a little more open to them maybe than some others. I more just because I feel like right now the age is 13, right? Like that's sort of the default age that kids can be on these platforms. That's not based in any science. That's not based in anything. That is a totally arbitrary age. And so part of me thinks like, because that was just sort of randomly selected as the default, why not raise that age by a couple of years, right? And like, I think that of course, there are many reasons why you wouldn't want to do that. And I've heard all those arguments articulated very well. But I do think in these conversations about technology and kids, like I think that we get into these sort of extreme views where I don't know, like I'm not sure that raising the age is necessarily the worst thing to do. And I think I just I'm somewhere in the middle on that. But
yeah, I think this is a point I've made in my Substack. It's really hard to be in the middle these days, right? And I think this does relate to how research is used in the media because of that pull towards more extremism that gets more attention and more shares. There's more attention on the extreme viewpoints, and then it's harder to feel comfortable taking a more moderate stance, right, as a parent. Like even in your community, it can feel uncomfortable. If everyone's very vocal about wait until 8th or no social media until 16, but you're doing it differently in your family, it feels like a failing, right? And kind of some shame attached to it. So I think it just all filters down in these very real ways. I think we need to touch on AI as the next frontier.
All right, I forgot about AI. Glorious minutes of not thinking about AI.
Just a real brief touch on this huge issue. But this really is the next frontier of fear, right, in parenting and in life. I mean, all of us are really unsettled, I think, about how to think about and feel about AI, how to engage with AI. But it's going to filter into our family lives of how do we manage this with our kids. So I know that Tracy and Jackie, you've both spent time on this, especially in Melinda. I don't mean to leave you out, but more explicitly, I know that Tracy and Jackie have spent time on this. So what could you tell parents about, or educators, everyone that's around kids, about what we really do know about AI and what we don't know yet?
I'll be very brief, and then I want to hand it over to Jackie because I've been talking too much. But I'll say that I think that the biggest things to look out for with AI are what you can think of as surrender: cognitive surrender, emotional surrender, and social surrender. Where kids and we, and sometimes it's the adults who have the bigger problem with this, definitely, are surrendering. In the case of cognitive surrender, our ability not just to think, but to have productive struggle with a question, to formulate a question, to do the hard parts of thinking, as well as writing and all the other stuff, right? Emotional surrender, right? There's this self-soothing, like just, give me these sycophantic words, but the social surrender, the companion AI, I can tell parents, do not let your child use companion AI. Just pause. Because we know that there's a lot of attachment hacking that is built into these models and how they are actually designed to respond to users. So I would say just don't have your kids use companion AI. Just if you're going to take a stance that's a little absolutist until we figure out more. Now, I will have to say a caveat because I think there are some helpful uses of companion AI in autistic spectrum, like, practicing social skills can be useful. We know there's a great study showing that in Alzheimer's patients, having a companion AI to practice like remembering things or talking through things actually increases and improves cognitive functioning and relieves caregiver burden and stress. So there are good uses, but I think we as parents should be extremely cautious about our kids offloading these key capacities that they need to build and work through and struggle with to become humans, to be fully functioning humans. So
Well,
I'll pause there.
like socially skilled, emotional IQ, those kinds of things.
All that takes work, and it
Yeah.
takes rupture and repair and mistakes and failure and discomfort. And AI it's designed to be frictionless and to remove all of that.
Yeah. One thing I've been thinking about with AI, Common Sense Media just came out with a survey a couple weeks ago, of over 1,000 kids ages 9 to 17. And one thing they found was that the vast majority of kids are using AI. So it was like 86% of kids had interacted with AI. So this isn't something that's coming, like this is something that is happening right now. The other piece that I thought was interesting is there was some evidence, both in this survey and in some other work that's out there, which I think is reflected across a lot of the digital technology research, not just AI, which is that kids who are vulnerable in some way in their offline lives, like they're sort of already struggling in some capacity, those kids are the most likely, maybe not surprisingly, to be struggling in their use of AI as well. So like kids who are already struggling in school, they might be the ones who are more likely to turn to AI, too much for their schoolwork. Kids who are already lonely in their offline lives, they might be the ones that are using AI more for companionship and more for emotional support and that kind of thing. And I just think that's something for us to be aware of. Like, I think especially as parents, because it speaks to this idea that we've come back to a few times about looking at the bigger picture of a kid, in terms of everything that's happening in their lives and who they are and what they're struggling with, and thinking about really the root of that versus just what exactly is happening via the technology, and maybe starting there with the child, with the human in front of you, rather than starting with the technology itself.
Excellent point.
And I'm so sorry, I have to contradict myself just for 30 seconds, which is there is a lot of a lot of it's archive research, like it's not peer reviewed yet, but a lot of research is coming out to suggest, we need to actually talk with our kids about how they're using. So I don't believe in banning companions, like they're going to do it. So even though I said ban them, but talk to your kids to understand how they're using these computer programs, which they are, and trying to understand what they're getting out of that so you can help guide them and to help them not offload those kinds of skills. And also the kids who are vulnerable, we may not know that they're vulnerable. There was a study that came out recently showed that the kids who had the most emotional over-involvement with their companion AI were actually the kids who were really popular and outgoing, but didn't feel seen. They didn't feel seen and accepted in their life. So it's not always who we think. Including ourselves in certain moments, who are vulnerable to getting over-involved and over-dependent on these models.
Yeah, that's a great point.
Thank you, Tracy. And you know what? You just role modeled flexible thinking and using the science flexibly. So thank you for that. Since we are almost out of time, I wanted to wrap up with a little bit of good news. So Melinda published a piece this March for Scientific American titled "The Kids Are All Right," with good news about today's youth. So I wanted to hand it over to Melinda to share some of what she discovered, and also maybe we can integrate how parenting norms and practices may have influenced some of these positive trends.
Yeah, it was a really fun and reassuring piece to report. Because we're hearing all of these scary narratives, I really wanted to dig into like, is this accurate? Like the whole kids these days, or, like everything's going to hell, that kind of thing. We're all our kids are ruined in the future. Everything's gonna be terrible. I really wanted to look at, like, is that true in all like various domains? And of course, there's needs to be more research, and there are caveats in terms of like what we can interpret for some of this research. But what a lot of research suggests is that in certain areas, there are a lot of good things where youth are actually now potentially more resilient in some ways, less narcissistic, more inclusive. There's some research suggesting that self-control and patience may be improving in kids rather than deteriorating. And I feel like with tech, we're always hearing like, oh, kids have no attention span anymore, right? And we know bullying, well, the research is really hard there, but teen drug and alcohol use, teen pregnancy are all down. So, it's a big question why this is happening. And when I interviewed researchers, they're all like, well, we don't really know. But they all mentioned parenting shifting towards warmth and respect, openness, conversations about technology, as Tracy was saying, so important. Emotional openness, like all of those things may be contributing. Schools and a greater emphasis on emotional learning might be contributing. So it does paint a much rosier picture than I think we get from the media and we get from John Haidt's book. And we were talking about why is his book so appealing, and I do think that there's some really interesting research suggesting that this idea that like, oh, the next generation is so much worse than like our generation, that is a result of cognitive biases. There's really fascinating research suggesting like that looked at like, why do we always believe this? Because it's not just our generation. It's like every generation of adults thinks the next generation is going to be ruined, right? And it's a result of various cognitive biases. I mean, obviously, yes, it's also legitimate to have some fear around AI and social media. It's not saying that this fear is totally unwarranted, but there is some cognitive bias in there. And I think, John Haidt's book and all of this media also just serves to kind of confirm in us these beliefs about like how the future is terrible. And so I think we also need to remember that that's one of the other reasons that it's appealing. It's like confirmation bias. But I found the piece to be cautiously optimistic. Like we need more research, and obviously kids are facing real challenges, but this blanket pessimism we have does not reflect the totality of the evidence that we have. And, we can be hopeful and recognize that our kids are actually doing really well in some areas and better than we were when we were growing up. And I think we can absolutely celebrate that.
Thank you, Melinda. And I'm going to add my non-scientific observation, very anecdotally, as I've been a therapist for 20 years, and I've seen the change in families in the therapy room where there is a lot more open communication. Parents are much more explicitly invested in the emotional growth of their child as well as the relationship they have with their child. And there's a lot more openness from the child to their parent. Whereas in the past, it felt like those had to be very separate. And now when I talk to kids about confidentiality, they often say, I don't care if my parents know. It's like, oh, well, that's new. So I think, again, this is anecdotal, but I think it would match the trends we've seen around kind of parenting norms and being more attentive to the relationship and our child's emotional well-being. So we can maybe end on that note. I'm so thrilled each of you were able to be here. I think this was a really lively, informative discussion. And I really appreciate the work that all of you are doing every day in this space. You're making the parenting world a better place. So thank you. I'm just going to go around and you can each share where listeners can find you and your work. Melinda?
My Substack, Now What, you can find at melindawmoyer.substack.com. And my website is just melindawennermoyer.com if you want to read more about my work, my non-parenting work as well. I write a lot about other aspects of science. And you can also read about my books, How to Raise Kids Who Aren't Assholes and Hello, Cruel World.
Jackie?
You can find my work generally on my website, which is just jacquelineneesey.com. And then my Substack, Technosapiens, is technosapiens.substack.com.
Tracy?
And my website is tracydennistiwari.com. Sorry, that's a little long, but the whole name.com. And then my Substack is called The Future of Sanity.
Thank you all so much for your time today.
Thank you.
Thank you, Emily.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you for listening to Psychologists Off the Clock. You can now listen to our podcast ad-free by becoming a supporter on Patreon. You can link to Patreon on our website or go to patreon.com/offtheclocksite.
If you enjoy our podcast, you can help us out by leaving a review and sharing this episode with a friend or an enemy who would enjoy it.
You can get more psychology tips by subscribing to our fabulous newsletter on Substack. Or if you're still addicted to social media, find us on Instagram and LinkedIn.
We'd like to thank our rockstar production manager, Jadine Stout-Williams.
Now for the boring part. This podcast is for informational and entertainment purposes only and is not meant to be a substitute for mental health treatment. If you're looking for mental health treatment, please visit the resources page of our website, offtheclockpsych.com.